I had a nightmare many years ago, toward the beginning of the time I was at seminary and sort of looking ahead a little bit fearfully about what might be coming and bringing some things behind me from the past that I was working with. And in this very interesting nightmare, I was holding a giant on a leash. This huge, hulking man. And I wasn't even half the size of the giant, not even up to his knees, but I'm just casually leading him around on this skinny little rope around his massive wrist. And the giant is just sort of following me obediently, docile, just sort of a glazed, harmless look on his face. And I was patiently trying to teach the giant something, but I can't remember what it was. And I started to get a little bit frustrated. And then the nightmare moved on, and I was sitting on the ground, and I had forgotten about the giant. Until I suddenly got that surge of panic that you get in a nightmare out of nowhere, and I turned and looked up, and the giant was there again, and he had this crazy, wild look on his face, and he lifted up his huge, massive arms, and he was swaying around and like staggering, like he was about to fall. I turned away and tried to get out of this shadow that was growing, and I just knew that the giant was about to land on me and crush me, and then I woke up. Put your hand to the plow, Jesus said. Don't look back. Nobody who looks back is fit for the kingdom. I think in this teaching, Jesus is letting his disciples know that the stakes are going up. They're going up for him, and they're going up for them as this story progresses if they want to continue to be his followers. I like a commentary on the Gospel of Luke by a person named Joel Green, and he says that the overall theme of Luke and Acts, which are two books written by Luke, the overall theme is the coming of salvation in all of its fullness to all people. So Jesus is moving this message throughout his region of Galilee and Nazareth. Last week, he piled all of his disciples in a boat and took them against their better judgment across the lake to the other side with this message of God's mercy setting people free. This time, we're one chapter further in the Gospel of Luke, and Jesus is traveling again, but this time he's going right to the center. Not over to the other side, to the margins. He's going to the center. He's going to Jerusalem. He's taking his message, salvation unfolding in all of its fullness for all people, to Jerusalem. And he's already started to talk to his disciples about the fact that he sees opposition and resistance to his message starting to kick up. And it's going to get difficult. And he tells them he's going to be arrested and he's going to be killed. So they're experiencing some fear. His message, breaking down social and religious barriers, God's dream of bringing all creation into communion with God and each other, is stirring up opposition. I think when Jesus says, keep your hand to the plow, no one who looks back is worthy of the kingdom, I think he's providing a moment of clarity. I think he's going for urgency with his disciples. Maybe something about counting the cost, like we heard in the children's time. I'm not sure, but I think he's saying something to them like, I don't know what you're dragging around from the past, hopes and expectations about what this might all mean. I don't know what you're trying to hold back. Fears of the future, of what might be, of what might be coming. But I need you to drop that rope and put both hands on the plow. I need your whole heart and your whole mind and your whole self with me on this journey. So the reading today was from Luke chapter 9. And this is the place where Jesus, for the first time, begins to tell his friends that he's going to be arrested and executed. He's opening up to them and letting them know what's coming. And I think it might feel like somewhat of a nightmare to them. This section that we're moving into in Luke chapter 9 is often called a travel narrative because it's a story about Jesus traveling to Jerusalem. And it's going to be difficult. And he's saying to his disciples, go with me anyway. Put your hand to the plow. Don't look back. This harsh sounding and extremely blunt statement from Jesus. Nobody who looks back is fit for the kingdom. It's a statement that was well known in the ancient Mediterranean world. Kind of a wise saying. And it rings true with common sense wisdom, too. Keep your hands on the plow, or you're going to have a crooked field and shallow rows and a bad harvest. It's not going to work out well. Pay attention, Jesus is saying. It's about to get rocky and uphill. We need both hands on the plow. In chapter 9:51, just prior to what Susie read, we hear Jesus say, when the time was getting near for Jesus to be taken up, Jesus set his face to Jerusalem. He set his face to Jerusalem. It's like he set his course, or he put the address into his Google Maps. Or more like he just knew. He decided. He knew where he was going to go. Whatever discomfort he had, whatever wondering he might have done earlier about where his ministry was leading him, about how his embodiment of God's mission would unfold, now it is clear to Jesus where he is going. His task is in front of him, and what it requires of him is to put one foot in front of the other in the direction of Jerusalem. He's totally caught up in God's dream with a rare, single-minded focus, even though it's becoming dangerous for him. And we hear him now insisting that those who want to come along with him must stay in touch with God's dream too, even as the journey gets dangerous for them. Let me show you what I mean. Going on from Luke 9:51, he set his face to Jerusalem, and then he sent messengers ahead of him. He sent some of his followers. And on their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But the Samaritans did not receive him because he had set his face toward Jerusalem. Well, the Samaritans and the Judeans, you may already know this, were rivals. They were kind of half-siblings, ethnically, religiously, but they mutually hated each other. The Samaritans in particular did not agree with the Judeans that Jerusalem was the place where God was to be worshipped. They focused instead on Mount Gerizim. This was their conflict. And maybe this moment when Jesus sends his followers into a Samaritan village to prepare for him to come with this message, maybe this could have been a moment for God's dream to begin breaking through in that village. But as soon as the Samaritans follow this old script of hatred between them and they reject Jesus' disciples, well, then Jesus' disciples get sucked into that old script of hatred and violence right along with them. And they come back and they ask Jesus this horrific question. It's like a nightmare of a question, but actually it's pretty predictable. They say, Jesus, Do you want us to command fire from heaven to come down on them and consume them? Wow, that's harsh. But they weren't making this up. This is part of the story of Elijah, a hero of their sacred story and ours. But the story charts a different course. As we see throughout the history of God's people, God walking us out of that nightmare of violence, walking us out of that nightmare into God's dream. And we see the people of faith circling around God's heart and losing their way and finding their way and losing it and finding it again back to the center of God's love. And Jesus is going straight for the center and not turning back. And he'll have nothing to do with this nightmare of religious violence. So he rebukes the followers and essentially throws water on their torches and tells them that's not the way. He's willing to tell them, in this case, that they're failing. But he's not telling them they're failures. Jesus is continuing to call them and to challenge them and to teach them and to encourage them to put both hands on the plow. With blunt honesty, he teaches them. I had a college music professor who did something like this for me with blunt honesty one time. There was a few semesters in college before I came back to Bible and religion as a focus of study where I studied music. And I had a course called oral theory where you learn to train your ear to hear different chords and intervals and things like that. And I had an exam coming up. The exam would just be listening. The professor would play chords and I would tell him if it's a minor chord or a minor seventh chord, or he would play an interval and I would say, that's a minor third, stuff like that. And I liked it. And I thought I kind of knew the material. But my problem as a young person was I was extremely intimidated by this professor. He was a brilliant man and just blunt and bristly, and I was terrified of him. I was afraid of him. So as the exam was coming closer, I just kind of didn't even think about it. I pretended it wasn't even going to happen. I didn't study. I just put it out of my mind. I just held it out of my mind. But it came anyway, and so there I was, standing in the room, just the three of us, the piano, Professor Gangemi, and me. And with hardly any introductions, he just began banging on the piano and looking at me expectantly. What's this? And I just froze. And so I started guessing, and I was guessing very, very poorly. And he just kept playing, louder and louder. And he looked at me. He didn't stop. With his left hand, he just kept playing. And he looked at me and he sang out, "Deron, you're failing." That's what he said. And I felt like I had burst into flames. And when I realized I hadn't burst into flames, I wished I could burst into flames. But that was not the end of the lesson, because he said, "Deron, you're not prepared. I don't even think you're really here. Go away and pull yourself together and come back at noon." So I was getting another chance to take this exam. So of course, suddenly I was completely focused on oral theory for 3 hours. Total clarity, total urgency. He put a fire under my feet. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I desperately wanted to do it. Why couldn't I get there on my own? I don't know. This was a second chance. It was an act of grace. It was a time for me to realize whatever fear and anxiety I was carrying around, it was time to just drop it and put both hands on the plow and give myself to what I was being called to do at that moment. Put your hand on the plow, Jesus said. Don't look back. Nobody who looks back is fit for the kingdom. When the disciples got sucked into fear and lost focus on God's dream, Jesus gave them this kind of gift of clarity and focus. It's like he's saying, dream God's dream. Forget about that nightmare. Dream God's dream right now, even though it's hard. Jesus, in fact, in the Gospel of Luke, starts to describe God's dream from the very beginning of his public ministry. You go back to Luke chapter 4, Jesus preaches for the first time in his hometown at Nazareth, and he begins by shouting the words of the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me. Yahweh has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, sent me to proclaim release for the captives and recovery of sight for the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of God's favor." Even farther back in the Gospel of Luke, even back to the story of Jesus' birth, God's dream shines through in the words that get repeated over and over again by these angel messengers that show up to people like Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, or to people like Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, or to people like a bunch of shepherds in a field at night who are afraid about what's going to happen. And these angel messengers announcing God's presence coming on earth, what do they say? They say, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid." This is why Jesus didn't turn around when the powers that be at his time resisted his upside-down kingdom, where, as he taught, the greatest would be the least, like little children. The poor would be lifted up, and power would be exercised through loving service. Do not fear. This is good news for all people. The Gospel of Luke tells the dream over and over again. Jesus' mother Mary prophesied and she sang when she learned she was going to have this child. And we sang it this morning. "My soul is filled with joy. You have looked upon the lowliness of your servant. You have visited your people. Holy is your name. You bring princes down from their thrones and lift up the lowly. To the hungry you give food and send the rich away empty." God's dream includes those who have been thrown out and kept out and shamed and blamed and ignored. God's dream brings the rich and the poor under the same roof. Jesus, giving hands and feet to God's dream, would guide our feet into the way of peace. And the words that John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, sang, "He will guide our feet into the way of peace." And on in Luke's gospel, we hear God's dream told as Jesus goes to the margins and breaks down barriers that keep people away from their own true home in the heart of God, and that keep them away from each other. It's no coincidence in the book of Acts, Luke's second volume, that the movement of Jesus' followers began to be called simply the Way. Because of this strange and unique and beautiful way that the followers of Jesus were trying to continue in the steps of their teacher and Lord, Jesus. And it looks and it feels a bit strange, then and now, but attractive. It's God's dream, and wherever a glimpse of it exists, I think it creates hope and joy. It's a way worth following. This is idealistic stuff. It can be. sounds very wonderful to live this dream and to follow Jesus. And it's why these blunt and harsh-sounding words from Jesus that we heard today are necessary. Ben Allenberger is a retired Old Testament professor from the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and he wrote an essay about Anabaptist biblical interpretation. Anabaptists were the movement in the late Reformation where the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonites get a lot of our theological inspiration. But he writes that the Anabaptist genius lay in the simple and expensive commitment to do what Jesus says. That's the hand to the plow, the commitment to do what Jesus said, to live God's dream right now, not to drag things from the past and not to worry about what the future might be, but to live God's dream right now. And it's our goal. It's our destination. I don't think I've gone very far in following Jesus yet in my lifetime. But that's why we're here. That's why I'm here. That's why I want to be a part of the church, the body of Christ, where we come for worship and learning and prayer, and where together we encourage one another to follow Jesus, where we learn to serve each other and those around us, where we give each other those words of grace and a second chance, where we are filled with the living Spirit of Christ. How else can any of this be more than just busyness? Put your hand to the plow. No, both hands. Keep busy and do a good job. It can become failed attempts at perfectionism. I've got to be good enough. Put your hand to the plow, and if you can't handle it, get out. That's not what Jesus is saying. I heard once that someone asked the Pope years ago, maybe it was John Paul, what would you do if you knew Jesus was coming back tomorrow? And he said, look busy. But Jesus wasn't calling for busyness or perfection. I don't think this is about who's good enough for God. We all are. It isn't about working hard enough to make it into heaven or something like that. It's an invitation to put both hands on the plow that points us in the direction of our destination, which is following Jesus, which is seeing a glimpse of God's dream of bringing all creation and all people into communion with our loving Creator. And it poses a question to me, now that I know the reality of God's love for all creation. What can I do with it? What opportunity do I have to share a glimpse of God's dream, to become an expression of God's dream? Now that I've seen God knocking down barriers and breaking chains that keep people from God and from each other, or that keep them from receiving their basic human rights, poor people or women or children or immigrants or LGBTQ people. Now that I've seen the circle of God's love expanding and yet being resisted in our world with every inch of progress, what can I do with this expansive love as I interact with the people in my small circle? Not every moment is filled with urgency. And we're not in this alone, trying to figure out what our big task is right now. But Jesus is with us at every moment, asking us to put our hands to the plow. Don't look back. dream God's dream.